Hello, and thank you for listening to my talk, and thank you to Abertay Historical Society for inviting me to give this talk for February 2022. My name's Erin Farley. I'm the Library and Information Officer for Local History at Dundee Libraries, and I'm going to be talking to you about finding folk tales in Dundee and Angus. And a big part of the reason I'm doing that is that I've recently finished writing this book, Angus Folk Tales, and that involved quite a lot of finding folk tales in Dundee and Angus. And I'm going to talk to you today about some of the other collectors who have kind of gathered these tales and how they might have shaped the sort of stories and the shape of the stories that we have passed down to us today. In particular, a few that I find really interesting from the 19th century. And I'm also going to tell you a wee bit about some of the things that I think about when I'm learning these stories and sort of changing them into the versions that I tell myself today. But to begin with, I am going to tell you a story. And this is a Dundee story that I'm going to begin with. It's one which is set at this building here, which will be familiar to many of you, Claypots Castle. Now, this was once the home of the Claverhouse family. But over time, they left it. They still owned it, but by the beginning of the 19th century, Claypots was on the land of the farm of Ballooney. And the farmer was using Claypots as a very distinctive farmhouse. Now, all through the centuries that Claypots has stood, it's been lucky enough to be home to a creature known as a broonie. And if you have a broonie in your household, then you should count yourself very fortunate indeed. But if you've never met one, they're sort of wee, hairy, wizened creatures covered in a sort of brown fur. And broonies are very helpful creatures. They're very strong for their wee size, and they're really happy to help out around the house, because broonies actually love having everything neat and tidy and in its place. And they'll do the housework, they'll sweep, they'll clean, they'll tidy up for you, but just as long as you leave them out a wee something, like a wee glass of milk or a bowl of porridge at night, because they prefer to come out at night. They tend to keep hidden away to themselves in the daytime. And Claypots had a broonie who served the household when it was the Claverhouse family, and the broonie stuck a bit, and he helped out around the farm as well when it was on the farm of Ballooney. But one of the farm servants at Ballooney, well, she was starting to get on the broonie's nerves a bit. You see, she was one of these people that could just cause chaos by standing still. And she didn't stand still. She was usually roaming about all over the place, making even more chaos as she went. When it was her turn to do the baking, she would scatter flour all over the countertops and all over the floor. And when she was doing the milking, she would spill the milk all over the flagstones as she took the buckets in. And well, the broonie didn't like any of this because he liked to keep a clean house. And even though she did try and tidy up after herself, she wasn't malicious or anything about it, but she would just forget her dishcloths, and there'd be rags and things scattered about all over the place, and she'd leave floors wet, half mopped. And oh, the broonie was just getting more and more annoyed with this young woman every single day. And on one afternoon, she'd gone out to the kale yard and she'd dug up some kale for that evening's meal. And she came wandering into the house, and her boots were trailing mud from the garden. And the kale was trailing mud off its roots as well, for she hadn't cleaned it off before she took it inside. And as she came sauntering into the kitchen with these bits of mud flying all over the place, the broonie was awake in his wee corner. He couldn't rest for thinking about it. And eventually he'd had enough and he stormed out into the kitchen. And he leapt up on the girl's back and he grabbed the kale out of her hands. And he started to thrash her with the vegetables. And he thrashed and he thrashed until the kale completely fell to pieces. And then he jumped down from the lassie's back and he stood in the middle of the kitchen. And now everybody from the farm had gathered round and they were waiting to see what the broonie would do. And he cursed the place, he cursed the farm and the lands around it with this rhyme. The ferry and the ferry well, the camp and the camp hill, Balmossy and Balmossy mill, Burnside and Burnhill. The thin sowens o' Drumgeeth, the fair May o' Moneyfeith. There's Gutherston and Wollaston, Claypots I'll gie my malice on. Come I late or come I ere, Balloony's boards are I bare. And with that, the broonie stormed out the castle and disappeared, never to be seen again. And as you know, Claypots does stand empty now, so maybe the broonie did take all the luck of the place away with him that day. Now, I learned this from a version collected by James Miles for his book Rambles in Forfarshire, which was published in 1850. And because of that, I think it's quite a good way of moving into talking about these 19th century collectors and the sort of things they collected. And it's also kind of a good illustration starting point because it has that rhyme at the end. And that's always a challenge because every time I do that story, I think I'm going to forget it halfway through. And it's an interesting example of these kind of folk rhymes that you get quite a lot of. I suspect there's actually a bit more of them in Dundee and Angus than there are in maybe other parts of Scotland. That could be my bias talking, but I certainly seem to spot quite a lot of them. And they tend to be just little rhymes. That's quite a long one, maybe a couplet, just a few lines, which tend to be said either as the beginning of a story or just sort of in relation to an event. And they're just a really short way of calling up a whole set of ideas and kind of shared knowledge. And I think they kind of serve to create a sense of place and tradition. And it's really interesting as well, trying to sort out when you start looking at this stuff, where the line is between literature and poetry and folklore and folk song, and it all just kind of merges into one another sometimes. And that's kind of the fun of it as well. It's just really interesting when you get diving into this stuff. And of the Victorian collectors that I'm going to do a quick run through of tonight, they mostly grew up in the places and the communities that they're collecting this material from. So the chances are they are quite familiar with a lot of it as they grew up. And that may be why a lot of them don't necessarily say exactly where they first heard something or where they first read it. It's stuff that's kind of in their cultural milieu and stuff that they are quite familiar with, I suspect. But sometimes in their books you will get things like, oh, I heard this from this particular woman or man in this village, and you do get a name sometimes. And I think the collectors, a lot of the time they are going out and sort of talking to people, but there's also a lot of delving into kind of older sources as well for these stories and bits of lore. They often, again, don't say exactly where they read historical legends for the first time as well if they've read them. But I get the impression that Hector Boyce's History of Scotland and Robert Lindsay of Pitscotty's Chronicles of Scotland are particularly sort of popular sources for them to be going back to in the 19th century. For example, there's the story of the cannibals at Den Fiend by Monique, and the sort of cannibal family that lurked in a den there and eventually sort of ventured out to snatch passers-by and eat them, and eventually they all got their comeuppance in Dundee, apart from this one young girl who they thought was young enough to save. But as she grew up, she sort of fell back into the ways of cannibalism, and eventually she was hanged as well, and sort of refused to repent for her cannibalism. There's a version of that that Lindsay of Pitscotty writes down, and it's quite similar to what you'd get if you asked somebody to tell you the story today as well. The actual core of what happens hasn't changed very much, and partly that's a sign of a good story, that once people have heard it, they remember it, and I think that's one that's kind of been passed down sort of in oral and print tradition, kind of going between one and the other. And that's the case probably for most stories, and certainly a lot of the ones I'll be talking about tonight. And I'll say a wee bit about James Miles himself. And he was born in 1819 in the village of Liff, not far from Dundee. He was apprenticed as a mason, but as a young man, he sort of moved away from that into sort of public speaking. He got very involved in the Chartist movement in his youth, and this was something that he would later kind of denounce for a more moderate position. But that sort of political involvement led him away from sort of manual work and into kind of the literary world. So he managed to open up a small bookstore in Dundee, and he sort of became a really central figure in a lot of the literary circles in mid-19th century Dundee. And a lot of the societies that Miles was part of that were flourishing around that time, they were sort of similar, a similar generation to Miles, and a lot of them are people who've grown up in a sort of rural setting, and then they've moved into Dundee to find work and kind of make their way in the world. But these societies were important support networks for young people in that position. And James Miles is actually probably best known among literary circles for being the author of chapters in the life of a Dundee factory boy. This was something that he kind of wrote as an improving moral story and presented it as if it was the autobiography of a young boy being corrupted by all the horrible experiences he was having working in the Dundee factories. And then kind of later sort of generations sometimes took this to genuinely be an autobiography of a factory boy. And so that's a really interesting example as well. I don't want to get too sidetracked talking about this, but of how texts kind of move between, is this literature, is this a historical source? And sometimes the lines can get very blurred there. And the Rambles in Forfarshire, which I mentioned earlier, is where I got the Bruni story, and it contains a lot of other sort of accounts of legends of things that happened, and little rhymes written by local worthies, all sort of mingled together. And he also started his own newspaper, Miles's Forfarshire Telegraph and Monthly Advertiser. And this was a mix of kind of comments on current affairs and improving literature and local history and folklore. It didn't last very long because Miles sadly died not long after starting it up. And I don't know how long it might have lasted had he not died. So another really interesting source for sort of Angus stories is Andrew Gervas. And he's kind of roughly a contemporary with Miles. He was born in Brecon in 1820. And he is really steeped in the print culture world of the day. He did an apprenticeship as a compositor in Brechin. He then had a job as a journeyman with the Dundee Courier for a while. Then he begins working with the Montrose Standard, and he starts writing a column there on gravestone inscriptions and the kind of folklore of these sort of almost gravestone inscriptions as a kind of folk poetry, maybe. But his first major publication is History and Traditions of the Land of the Lindsays, which he publishes in 1853. Now, the land of the Lindsays is kind of Strathmore. The Lindsay Crawford family was one of the big names, big landowners around Strathmore. And this is a book which kind of does present these traditions as something which is declining, and maybe something which is not as easy to come by as the olden days. This is sort of an attitude that is shared by, I think, all of these collectors, and the sense that ways of life are changing, and that these stories and traditions will disappear if we don't write them down now. And I think this is something that every generation of folklore collectors kind of feels. It often always feels like you're at the last gasp of being able to collect things, and yet the things keep going through a mix of the oral tradition and sort of new print sources, and they just kind of keep adapting, and that's it's kind of reassuring, but it's also still worth trying to gather them and just see what happens. And it's an interesting one, Gervas publishing The Land of the Lindsays. It's an interesting position he's in as a chronicler, because I don't know how much money the Lindsay family might have put into supporting him to write this, because he wasn't independently wealthy. They certainly encouraged him, and he did have patrons supporting his work at various times. But half the stories, well, more than half of the stories about the Lindsay family are about how they're kind of feckless, drunken, violent, terrible landlords. And it's, he doesn't, he certainly doesn't lie about that in his presentation. He kind of has a disclaimer at the start about these being kind of the fables of an illiterate age, and how he's tried to include evidence to the contrary if such has been found. And there really are a lot of these stories that Gervas and others collect, and they do sort of speak to quite a painful relationship between the people who are working on the land and the people who own it. And there's one particular story about Lord Lindsay sort of hosting an archery contest at his castle in Finhaven. And as he sort of eventually kind of shows off more and more, he starts kind of using his servants as target practice, and it's quite a horrible story, and it almost, like all of these things, it didn't happen, but the fact that that these are the sort of stories that are surviving, and that people have sort of told to one another, I think says something kind of real about that kind of relationship between worker and landowner. And Gervas is another one who's very involved in literary and poetic culture. He collected broadsides and ballads and stuff himself as well, and he has an entry in Bards of Angus and the Mearns for poetry that he wrote himself. And I'm quite upset that what is described as a mass of popular literature that Andrew Gervas collected was broken up and sold at auction, and I don't know where all the various bits of it ended up, which is a shame, because I would love to see what he'd gathered in his collecting of popular literature. And there was something that Gervas said about his practice of collecting, specifically about poetry. He said that from the highest poetical flight to the merest doggerel, he amassed specimens. And he used to say humorously that good verse will take care of itself, but Crambo-clink requires a keeper. And I quite like this as a sort of mission statement. I might take this on myself as well. And now another one of the collectors who came from Brechin was David Herschel Edwards. And he, again, is probably better known as a literary figure than as a folklore collector. He sort of left school when he was 13, and he managed to get a job at the Brechin Advertiser. And the manager of the Advertiser at that time was the president of the Brechin Literary Society. So Edwards joined there, and he started writing essays, and essays on local folklore was one of his preferred topics. So we're moving a wee bit forward in generations here. He was born in 1846. And he again really gets stuck into a career in local newspapers. And he eventually ends up taking over as editor of the Brechin Advertiser in 1879. And he compiled books on folklore and poetry. His first book sounds like it was a real sort of labour of love and also a joint effort with his wife. He recalls sort of typesetting this at night after his day job using a small hand press, and his wife would ink the types after they'd got the bairn to sleep. So this, it's just a really lovely image, that I think, of the dedication that they both had to making these books happen. And Edwards' best known work by far is the 100 Modern Scottish Poets series, which was published across multiple volumes between 1880 and 1897, sort of collating the best of contemporary poetry. And it's a really, really useful source, that for local and now sort of lesser known 19th century writers. But he's kind of not really remembered as a folklorist, but he wrote sort of hundreds of kind of articles and little guidebooks and collections of sort of lore and history of particularly Brechin and its surrounding area, but also the rest of Angus as well. And he also wrote a column in the guise of Auld Eppie in the Brechin Advertiser. So he would write in Scots, similar maybe to Thomas Bodkin in the People's Journal, and he had this sort of persona of Auld Eppie, who was an old wife, this character, who cannot help thinking. And she would start off her column reflecting on a point of contemporary news, and then kind of veering into how this relates to some ancient legend of Brechin, which also sounds like a really fun thing to do. And a couple more that I want to mention just now. There is James Carngill Guthrie, and he was actually the first librarian at the Albert Institute. He came from a sort of rural Angus family. And his sort of major work in terms of folklore collecting was The Vale of Strathmore, its scenes and legends. And that's a really good source for a lot of stories which don't always, but tales that there aren't a lot of print sources for anywhere else. And he's somebody that I need to do a lot more looking into, actually. He's a very interesting character. And we also have Alexander Lowson, who is from Forfar. And we're now coming kind of later in the 19th century, so he's active kind of 1890s into the early 20th century. And Alexander Lowson seems to be probably the most well-to-do of all of these people that I've spoken about. He was a councillor and a magistrate in Forfar for many years. He was also a governor of Forfar Poorhouse, and his appointment there seems to have been quite controversial. The Forfar Herald kind of questioned if he had the appropriate qualifications to do this. But as well as all this, he wrote a selection of books about the sort of history and characters of Forfar. And he is also a really intriguing character because the stuff that he comes out with is just really interesting. And it's not all this like good interesting. It generally is, but he publishes this collection, Tales and Legends and Traditions of Forfarshire. I've got an early cover of it here, which is just really brilliant. He did have great cover designs. And he wrote also this long novel, John Goodfellow. And this is, it's a strange book. It's named after a sort of local worthy character who was also known as John Goodfellow, as far as I can gather. But he kind of reimagines this local worthy into something maybe almost like Tom Bombadil in The Lord of the Rings, this kind of mysterious figure who sort of appears and guides the characters on this sort of epic romance / murder plot, and into that plot is squeezed kind of the plot of every Angus legend that he can get in there. So it's there's a lot going on in there, and it's another one where you don't know what's actual legend and what's something that's been sort of made up for the sake of the plot always, and you can usually get a pretty good sense of it just from the kind of way it's written. But yeah, it's a very interesting book. And Lowson again was involved in newspapers, and he credits his he was also a founding editor of the Forfar Reformer newspaper. And this was another kind of short-lived newspaper, and it was printed between 1883 and 1885. And this wasn't intended as a main news source, but it was kind of a locally based voice for political reform. And like many sort of 19th century newspapers, it included kind of a lot of literary output. And one of the other really interesting things that I find about the Forfar Reformer newspaper is that it's got this feature called Anecdote Corner. And they use this to share sort of wee stories about local characters. And there's one which kind of sums up the sort of thing you can expect quite well. And it's about Tam Dixon's eagle. And he's sort of talking about in the days of the late Provost Webster, there was a town councillor whose name was Tom Dixon or Tam Dixon, and this Tam Dixon, somebody had given him a gift of an eagle, and he had this just this great golden eagle in a lovely big cage in his back court. And the provost came round to see it one day and was kind of going around marveling at this wonderful eagle, and oh, what a beautiful bird, Thomas, he's lovely, but pray tell me, what use is he? And then it became a proverb in Forfar. Lowson says that when any person becomes possessed of an article, be it house, carriage, or horse, that could have advantageously been done without, well, it is something like Tam Dixon's eagle, more ornamental than useful. And that's just the kind of level of stuff. It's really small stories that's kind of funny, particularly if you know the people involved. But just with this sort of kind of sense of humor as well, this kind of down to earth puncturing of kind of pomposity of these figures. And there's loads and loads of stories in this vein that can be found kind of in among these bigger stories, tucked away in newspapers and included in these collections. And they're brilliant, a lot of them. And I did want to include sort of some of them in my book to give a sense of what this culture sort of feels like. But it was quite hard choosing which ones, because a lot of them really don't make sense unless you were there or you know the people involved. And I think sometimes I tend to feel like I know a lot of 19th century Dundee characters that I don't necessarily know. It just feels like it because they crop up so often in my work. And I have to remember that nobody else has ever heard of these people, so it's not funny to them. And Alexander Lowson, he credits his grandfather, a man called Donald Jolly, with having supplied many of the sort of bigger stories that he includes in his Tales and Legends of Forfarshire book. And his grandfather sort of wrote them down for Lowson before he died. And he also mentions another key informant sort of source of stories, whose name was James Donald. So more research by me needed in this area as well. I'd like to see if I can try and find out anything about either Jolly or James Donald to find out where they might have learned their stories, because some of the ones that Lowson includes in Tales and Legends of Forfarshire are absolutely fascinating. In particular, one which I'll talk a wee bit more about later, called The Twins of Edzell. But for now, I shall move on. And I think, given that I'm on the verge of actually talking about some proper history here, I will stop that immediately and tell you another wee story while we're in the realms of Forfar. And this is a story, it's actually from much, much longer ago than this postcard of Castle Street in Forfar. This is a story which takes place in about the 1670s. And there was a woman in Forfar at that time who kept an alehouse. And every day she had the same routine. She would get up and she would brew up a fresh cog of ale for the day. And she would set the ale out to cool on her doorstep. And then she would go about and get the inn tidied up and get the fire set and get ready for another day. So there was one day she'd done this as usual, and she set the ale out on the doorstep to cool down to a nice drinkable temperature, because it was warm when you'd finished brewing it. But this particular day, our neighbour's cow had broken out of its pasture. And the cow, she was wandering about the streets of Forfar, having a grand day to herself, enjoying her freedom. But it was quite a warm day, and the cow was starting to get a wee bit thirsty. And she saw there on the doorstep what looked like a lovely, big, refreshing drink of water. So the cow, she wanders over and she takes a slurp. And the first slurp goes down very, very well. So she takes another slurp and another and another. And soon the cow has drunk up the whole bucket of ale and staggers off into Forfar to cause more chaos. And soon the innkeeper, she comes out and she sees her ale is gone, and she is fuming. And it doesn't take long for her to spot the culprit, because there's this cow staggering around, pulling down washing lines and trampling through folks' gardens and just causing the sort of mess that only a drunk cow can cause. And she storms round to her neighbour's house immediately and she says, "Your cow has drunk up all my ale and you are going to hate to pay for it." And our neighbour was having none of it. He said, "Oh, come on, you're the one, you left it on your doorstep. It's your problem. You should have been keeping an eye on it." And he refused to give her any money. But the innkeeper, she was not going to let this lie. So soon her and her neighbour were standing across from each other at opposite sides of the Forfar courthouse. The cow was sleeping it off by this point and she was unable to come and represent herself. And the judge, he'd never heard of a case like this before. How was he going to make a decision about this? And the innkeeper stood there and she fumed, look, if any other body took a drink in my alehouse, they'd hate to pay for it. And the judge, he thought over and over all the cases, all the laws that he'd read in his life about alehouses and hospitality. And he thought, and eventually he said to the neighbour, tell me, when your coo took this drink, was she standing? Was she standing? Come on, man, tell me, who else would a coo take a drink? And the judge said, well, I'm afraid that settles it. If the drink was taken standing at the door of the alehouse, then ancient Scots custom has it that this is a stirrup cup. It's a drink offered in goodwill, and it would not be right to charge for it. And so from that day on, the old Scots custom of the stirrup cup was enshrined in the law of Scotland. And a saying was born, be like the coo of Farfar and tak a standing drink, which you would say to somebody who was maybe about to leave without having had one for the road. Now, I certainly hope there's no legal historians in tonight. But that, again, I think is a really nice example of these kind of local legends and little explanatory stories that crop up among the tradition. Now, I'm going to take this as just a brief opportunity to say a little bit about some of the more recent collecting that has happened since the 19th century. Because obviously we've had one big development in our ability to collect things. First audio and then kind of video recording technology has meant that collectors have been able to actually record voices and stories as storytellers tell them. And this is a very exciting thing. So in the 20th century, you've got a lot of collecting coming from the School of Scottish Studies based in Edinburgh, but they had people going out collecting all around Scotland. And there's some great stories, again, from Forfar. I would recommend going on the website Tober and Dulcus or Kister Riches, which has a lot of these recordings available digitally. And there's a lot of recordings made with a woman called Jean Roger, who was a school teacher in Forfar, and she has contributed a lot of local stories and children's rhymes. Recorded by Emily Lyle, and Jean Roger also published some pamphlets of kind of fictional versions of Forfar life herself. But this image is a picture of kind of picking berries in Strathmore in Angus, and the berry picking was somewhere that a lot of these folk collectors in the 20th century would go straight to in Angus, but also particularly in Blairgowrie, because this was a real centre for the travelling people of Scotland who knew just sort of loads of stories and songs. And one of the collectors who did a lot of important work around Blairgowrie, Dundee and Angus is a man called Maurice Fleming. He worked with the School of Scottish Studies, and he collected and worked with Mary Brooksbank and the travelling family, the Stuarts of Blair. And he published collections of tales himself as well. One focused on East Perthshire, but also one focused on the Sidlaws, Tales, Traditions and Ballads, which was published in 2002. And this is a kind of Angus Perthshire bridging area, but there's a lot of sort of great versions of stories from Angus in there, and he tells them very well as well, so I would recommend looking that one up. And another tradition bearer that I want to mention is Betsy White. She was from, well, she settled in Montrose, and she was part of a traveller family who spent a lot of time around travelling around Angus, and she's been recorded many times for the School of Scottish Studies, and there's some great examples of her stories about the ghosts at Glams on Tober and Dilkis. But she also was an author herself, and she wrote several books talking about her culture and her life experiences. And also, while we're on sort of 20th century sources, there have been some really, really great local publications come out at various points across the 20th century. And Duncan Fraser has written several kind of collections of local history. We've got the Carnpoke of Arthurshire, which is Ernest Mann collected this. And it's a sort of jumble of, you know, extracts from older sources and kind of his retellings of local legends. And then we have this, which is my absolute favourite of any kind of pamphlet cover ever, Dinny Fleg the Bairns, which is a wonderful collection of Dundee urban legends, which was published by a writer called J. Burke with Broken Windy Publishing. And I've not been able to find much, despite the fact that this is one of the more recent ones. I haven't been able to find much about J. Burke or you know, their work on this. So, you know, I'd absolutely love to know anything about them. If somebody has any connections to them out there, please do let me know. Yeah, these have been wonderful sources as well for finding stories to tell. So I'm going to conclude now by sort of telling you a wee bit just about my process of storytelling and how I learn stories from these older sources. And this image here, it appears on my book cover, and it's a painting done by the absolutely wonderful artist Catherine Suter-Caddick. And it's inspired by the story The Twins of Edsel, which is one of those which Lowson collected, and one of the ones he got from his grandfather. So this is kind of where I leave any pretense at doing any sort of proper history behind, and just kind of talk about sort of vague concepts and process. And the proper historians among you are probably like, that's what you've been doing all night. How much worse is it going to get? So a lot of the stories which are in my collection, Angus Folktales, are ones which I had known for quite a long time. And there's two or three which I feel like I've known my whole life. In particular, the story of Jockey Barefoot, which is one that I heard from a family growing up. My auntie Fiona used to tell this story. And it's one of the kind of horrible ones where everybody meets a very sticky end, and it was definitely one that kind of scared me as a child, but that's probably why I remember it particularly well. And the version that I seem to remember is kind of different from a lot of the print versions that I've found of it. And in cases like this, where I sort of feel like I know a version that's a bit different to one that appears in print, I actually had to kind of tell myself it's okay if I use that version, because that's not wrong. It's the version that I know. And sometimes I find it hard to trust myself, and that I have as much right to kind of shape these as anybody else. Yeah, I've been kind of on the lookout for Angus folktales to tell for a long time before I sort of got up the courage to pitch this book. So a lot of them had been kicking around in my head for a long time. But then there were others that I was kind of either learning anew or finding or deciding whether to include. And it does help in this case to have privileged access to a local history collection, which has copies of kind of most of these older books, especially when you're writing during a pandemic. And this is where I admit to maybe taking books home that I probably shouldn't have taken out of the library, but I certainly didn't take anything that we only had one copy of or anything like that. But yeah, I spent a lot of my time after work in lockdown kind of going through these older collections of books, and I've also made some very useful pre-pandemic visits to Angus archives as well. And I ended up kind of living in this strange place in my head where I had these kind of voices of 19th century men sort of as a constant companion, and really sort of thinking about this sort of balance between oral tradition and print tradition and poetry and storytelling. And it's a complicated mix, but it's one that I really enjoy working with as a kind of range of sources. And I'm starting to feel quite at home with it because a lot of that sort of odd, sort of obscure print sources and things where you're not quite sure where it came from, that's something that will be familiar to anyone who's done research in the Lamb collection, which is one that I work with every day in Dundee libraries. And it's interesting because in some ways, as somebody who has kind of started working in a library, as some of these people did as well, then it's interesting because I can feel that maybe my experience mirrors theirs in some ways, but in other ways it's completely different. And there's so much that I don't know about the way that that the people who told these stories before me saw the world, and also how they would have told these stories if you were sort of just speaking to them rather than getting a version that they've created with 19th century sort of editorial expectations and audience expectations in mind. Because the versions that I've written are not exactly the same as the versions that I've told this evening, and they're not the same as the versions that I'll tell tomorrow. And these things do change sort of every time you tell them. But also, you know, I've changed the way that I've written things because I'm aware I'm writing sometimes for an audience that doesn't know this place intimately, and it's an audience who might not always speak Scots. So there's definitely there are characters who just will not speak anything but Scots, and I couldn't make them not speak Scots. But I think maybe a lot more of the stories would have been in Scots if I was writing this kind of in a different context. And I definitely find that as I get to know the stories and get to tell them in my own way, I find different things to focus on than maybe the 19th century written versions do. And this isn't a conscious sort of rewriting. I don't kind of sit there and go, right, what perspective am I bringing as kind of a 21st century woman to this story? It's something that kind of happens a bit more subtly than that. And generally, I suppose what I tend to do is kind of read it, you know, quite a few times when I'm trying to get to learn a story, and read their version of it and sort of let it sit in my head for a while. And think about what comes out of the story to me, because often that won't be the words in the same order, and it'll be, you know, there will be kind of images and moments and things that a character might say that start coming out really clearly to me in my mind, and then I start trying to figure out what the story means to me. And then try and let the story speak rather than the words or its source. And this does sound sounds a bit woo to be trying to put it into words like this. But for example, the story of the twins of Edzell, I'd love to tell it for you, but it really is quite a long one. And It's, as I said, one of Alexander Lauzon's, and on the first reading, I really wasn't sure if I actually liked this story. Because his version was partly it was written in quite sort of wordy 19th century literary language, but it portrays the two main characters are deaf twins from a traveller family, and it's definitely ableist, and it's probably a bit racist as well. And I was sort of thinking, what do I do with this story? But as I kind of sat with the idea of the story, the actual central characters, which is the twins and their mother, who kind of exist on the boundaries of the mainstream society of Edzell, and they've got this kind of uneasy relationship with the wild world, the wolves and the animals in the forests, but also with the people of the village, and the kind of the Lord Crawford, who has power over all of them in their lives. And that started to really come out, and the twins and their mother kind of started to take on their own life in my mind. And I haven't changed anything in terms of what happens, but I've kind of changed the point of view that I tell it from, if you see what I mean. I haven't sort of given anybody a happy or unhappy ending that they didn't have in the original story, and it's still a very kind of uneasy story. It doesn't kind of end neatly, and it doesn't resolve things, and it kind of leaves you a bit haunted, and it certainly leaves Edzell Castle a bit haunted. And there's not a lot of sources for this one, and I'm sure that Lauzon, when he was creating his version, I'm sure that he edited and possibly added bits into the narrative, but I trust that he didn't completely make everything up about this story, because I think if he did, it wouldn't work in that way. It wouldn't have worked for me to kind of take on this new form of it, because I suspect he would have written something which maybe ended more neatly, or had a kind of more coherent narrative to it. It feels like a folk tale. And this is obviously not something which is going to stand up in peer review or as a kind of historical argument. But I think sometimes in this kind of game, you just have to go, this feels like a folk tale, and I'm going to go with it. So I'm going to sort of wind up now and let you go about the rest of your days. Yeah, what do these stories mean, and why are we still telling them? In particular, like, why am I still telling them? And I think that just one of the ways that folk tales and legends have often been presented is as a way that people understood history and nature kind of before we knew better, before we knew everything, before we understood everything. And I think this sort of does a disservice to storytellers and their listeners over the generations, because people have always been able to handle the idea of different kinds of truth, and have understood that maybe some things didn't literally happen, but these are a way of sort of pointing out what matters, and they're ways of kind of mapping an area through memory, and ideas of what has gone before us in these places, and how should that change how we relate to these places today. And sometimes they're a way of warning you off certain places or ways of being, and sometimes they're a way of kind of encouraging you onto other ways of being and ways of living in a place. And I think I am biased, but I think there are still things that we can get from sort of telling and listening to these stories, perhaps in the modern era, and just seeing how they continue to grow with us, and what we continue to find in them and bring to the stories as well. So that is the end of my talk for just now, and hopefully I will see most of you at the Q&A session. So thank you very much.